Okay, so I ran into a problem. Let me show you what the problem is. So this is the graph. If I go like that, it should be static, right? But it's not. It starts climbing up. And I drew it up so that you could understand it, so that I could understand it. And so this is the first, this is the input. Those are the ones that I check. And then in the next generation, it goes to that. So 8 goes from not being alive to being alive, and then this all forms around it. And then for the third, you can see that 2 becomes alive, which doesn't make sense because we go from 2 not having any neighbors to spawning, so that doesn't work. But we can figure that out. And then the 4, the 8, and the 6. So you go from here to here to here. And so I made up this little chart here so that we can understand. So 1 through 3 only have they're all connected to 5, right? That's their neighbor. And then for 4 through 7, that has 2 neighbors, that has 2 neighbors, and that has 2 neighbors. 7 has 2 neighbors. 8 has 4 neighbors. And so I wrote down here that 8 has 4 neighbors, but it's not alive right now. That's what the status means. So that's 8. And then 9 has 2 neighbors. 10 has 2 neighbors. 11 has 2 neighbors. 12 has 2 neighbors. And 13 through 15 all have 1 neighbor. So I've got that all written up. So 13 through 15 only have 1. The rest all have either 2s or that 1 4, that one guy in the middle. And so those are all alive, but the one in the middle is not alive. But the interesting thing is, in the next generation, the next spawn, if you will, what happens is that 8 becomes alive, 9 becomes alive, 10 becomes alive, 11 becomes alive, and so does 14. So if you look at this, you can see that 4 becomes alive, 2 stays alive, 2 does not become alive, 2 stays alive, 2 stays dead. So that's what I'm all trying to figure out what's wrong here, is because 2 on number 5, on cell 5, it has 2 neighbors and it dies. On cell 6, it has 2 neighbors and it doesn't spawn. But all the way down here on 9 has 2 neighbors and it stays alive. And then 11 has 2 neighbors and it stays alive. But even 14, which only has 1 neighbor, becomes alive, which doesn't make sense because then 13 would become alive, 15 would become alive, 1 through 3 would all become alive if 1 neighbor meant that it came alive. So that's very confusing there. But now let's look at the third generation. So over here we have square number 2, which is right there, which had 1 neighbor in the beginning, and then it didn't have any neighbors, and now it suddenly has 2 neighbors and it becomes alive. So it goes from 0 neighbors to alive, which doesn't make any sense. And then for number 4, it goes from having 1 neighbor to being alive, 1 neighbor and dead to being alive. And then with number 6, it has 2 neighbors and then it becomes alive. But that doesn't make sense because then wouldn't Wouldn't that become alive? Wouldn't 15 become alive because 15 also has 2 neighbors? So it's very interesting how this works. And then it looks like 8 goes from having 3 neighbors and being alive to suddenly having 2 neighbors but still being alive. And then at the same time, 10, which also starts with 3 neighbors and being alive, suddenly dies and doesn't have any neighbors, or has 1 neighbor instead. So I hope you can understand this. I don't understand why this happens, but I do understand that it is happening, and that when I press the start button, instead of being static, which it should be, it moves up the grid. So if I hope this helps in explaining explaining what's wrong with the program, because I'm trying to understand it. I hope maybe you can. Thank you.